everybody, and welcome back to The Hobby Musician. You're joining us today as we work ourselves through a mini-series of the most ambitious project we've ever undertaken here at the channel. We are currently building a matched set of guitars completely from scratch and completely from salvaged or scavenged wood. Now, if you want to get caught up on any of the previous episodes in case I mention something or refer to something in today's show, or if you just want to jump around to the different phases of the build, maybe to find something a little closer to what you're working on today, make sure you click the link at the top and that'll open up a playlist where I've arranged every step of the process as we release this whole project. Well, today we're going to specifically focus on the cosmetic top piece that I've envisioned for these instruments. Now, previously when we kind of talked through how we put together the blanks, the laminated blank pieces of wood to cut out the bodies and the necks, we saw that we were just using salvaged wood. So we were having all of these strips of different colors and gradations of what wood we had access to. But I mentioned in those videos that there was a technique that I had kind of thought up that I wanted to do to make sure that as you look at the instrument, the top cosmetically kind of looks nice and has a cool vibe to it. So what we're doing is we're going to create basically a tile, almost like a kitchen backsplash tile pattern that you're going to see kind of repeated all the way across the top, and we're still going to use the boards that we salvaged from our shipping pallets. Now, what I did was when I was breaking down the pallets, there were a couple of them that were just in better shape than others. So here's an example of the top piece, like the kind of flat parts where they would put the cargo. This is an example of just one of those boards. And on that pallet, some of the boards you can see here had some slight differences in hues. We had some lighter, kind of yellower ones, and we had some darker brown ones. But at the end of the day, they were all almost exactly the same thickness, and they were all in pretty good shape. So I saved all of these, and we planed them down so that they're nice and flat on the top and the bottom. And the first thing that I did to create my tile pattern was I set up my miter saw. And you can see here, I kind of did a little jig, like a homemade rig, where I clamped in a piece of wood that was going to stop any of the additional pieces of wood at the exact same length when I would put in the next strip and cut it. And then I would take out that piece and I'd put the strip back in and cut it. And every time it was butting up against that wood that I clamped in there, so every strip that I was cutting ended up being exactly the same length. Now, I had very carefully prepped the wood after I pulled it off the shipping pallets here. A good friend of the show, Randy Race, had let me come over to his wood shop, and we used his table saw, and we took all of the thicker boards that we pulled directly off the pallets, and we just zipped them down into these 1-inch strips. And it was these 1-inch strips that I was cutting through the miter saw. Now, you can then see I did a lot of those cuts because I knew that the surface area of 2 instruments was going to be significant. So you can see here that when I was done, I had a box full of 2-inch strips of 1-inch thick wood. And the goal of that all together was to glue them side by side so that the 2 inches long and the 1-inch thick would end up making 2 by 2 inch square tiles just like this one. And you can see in this picture, it took a while. I spread out the table, got the wood glue, and just glued these 2 strips together and just did as many of them as I could to make sure that I had enough. After I had all my tiles cut and laid out, I needed to make sure that I had planned well enough and created enough tile patterns to actually successfully cover the faces of the instrument. So you can see here in this picture, I started to lay them out in the rough shapes that I knew the bodies were going to be. And once I had them kind of laid out, I used the templates that we had created earlier to set on top of these grid patterns to make sure that the entire outline of my templates, my eventual templates, would fit within the grid pattern of these tiles. That way I could ensure that once I cut out, when everything was glued in place and I cut it out, the entire top surface would be covered. So that's what you can see here. I made sure that I had everything. Then I had to go back and do some initial passes at gluing the tiles together. Now we already made the tiles, so one piece glued to another, so I had squares like this, but I needed all of the squares to be glued to all of the other squares to create a solid piece that I could then sandwich glue on top of my body blanks. So you can see here, I had to glue them in long strips. So I took that grid pattern and just glued them all vertically where they needed to go. And then slight variations, you know, the little edges weren't quite level, and so those vertical strips needed a little bit of sanding. And I set up my belt sander, like you can see in this time lapse, so that I could take the vertical strips and just smooth out their sides or their edges, so that then I could do a second pass of gluing and come back and glue the vertical edges together. You can see here I set up my clamps, did little strips of wood glue in between there, and held them all together so that the grid patterns that I laid out initially now were entirely glued together. Well, all I had to do from that point on was to take that pattern and just glue it completely, surface to surface, glue it onto the wood blanks that I had made for the bodies. And that's what you can see here. After that was done, now we're ready to start cutting. I got my templates back on and I traced the outlines, and I just started with my jigsaw. The whole point of this project, we said at the very beginning, was I really wanted to accomplish as much of this in a DIY, kind of do-it-yourself, at-home method. And you can use a jigsaw to cut out the rough shape of the body. Now you can see in this picture, the best way to do this is to leave 1 or 2 millimeters. I just wanted to leave a little bit of clearance on the outside of these lines so that we could come back with things like routers and use our templates to get really, really clean cuts and a clean body shape. So that's what I did next. I took our wooden template and I used a trick that I learned from Crimson Guitars. Check out their YouTube channel, tons of great building videos and tips and tricks for how to build your own instruments. But one of the things that they do is they can use masking tape or painter's tape and some super glue. If you put a strip of tape down on one side and a strip of tape down on another side and put super glue on the tape, you can super glue the two things together in a very, very strong bond, but then it can also come off because you just peel off the tape. So that's what you see here. I took painter's tape and put some super glue. So I wanted to really affix the template back onto this cutout shape, because once I had it firm, I clamped that whole thing to the table, and then I took my router and went around the edge. Now you can see here in this little slow-mo, I was feeling artistic one day, so I tried to get a little close-up slow-mo shot, but as the router goes around, it follows whatever guide that you give it, like our curved template, and it really smooths out that edge and gives you a nice sharp finish. But you can see in this picture that I ran into a problem when I went around one pass. Because my template pieces were so thick, the router bit actually didn't go down far enough to cut the whole body. So I had to then take off, after I went around once to create the initial curve, I had to peel off that template. The painter's tape comes off, like I said before, pretty easily. And then I used the piece itself, that top lip became the guide to then cut a second pass around the shape to get the full top to bottom smooth edge all around our body blanks at this point. Well, it's starting to look like a guitar now, but I still had some issues to deal with. The hand gluing of all these tiles together inevitably means that there were going to be high points and low points. And so when I would run my hand over the top of this thing, it would come back full of splinters. There is no way that this was smooth enough to be a final project. And you can see in this picture, if you look closely enough, you see glue bits have squirted out, and it's just high and low, even though the edge of the entire thing is nice and smooth now. So to fix all of the uneven surfaces on the front and the back of these bodies, I went on the Craigslist and I was able to find for 20 bucks an old school jointer, as you can see here in this picture. Now the benefit of a jointer like this is it can be configured to be completely flat. And even though the length of the blades on this are a little over 4 inches, the fact that it can be completely flat means I can take a larger piece of wood like these bodies and I can go multiple passes back across and work my way 4 inch by 4 inch by 4 inch across a surface, and I can set the depth of the cutting blades to take off as much or as little wood as I want per pass. So you can see in this time lapse that I just set up with these bodies, and to fix and to smooth out the tops and the backs, I just took them one pass by one pass. I set the machine very, very light at first because I didn't know how much I was going to take off. But even if I set it for a 1/16 of an inch, if you can start to do the math, I can thin out those bodies to exactly the thickness I want with only a few passes. If I did 2 passes over the entire front and 2 passes over the entire back, that's 2 and 2, that's 4/16. That's a 1/4 of an inch that I can adjust and bring down the thickness to get the actual ending thickness that I was shooting for. And in the process, you're smoothing out both of the front and the back surfaces. Well, after everything was said and done, it's not perfect. As you're going, you're doing this by hand, and sometimes, you might be holding it at a little angle. So even though the majority of the surfaces were flat, you can see in some of these pictures that there would be like maybe little uneven grooves. Maybe I was having it at a little angle in one pass, and then the next pass it was different. But the benefit of this is that level, those grooves, were so easy to come out with a hand sander afterwards. So now we're sitting with a body that is routed nice and smooth, and the top and the bottom are nice and smooth. The last thing that I wanted to do to get this cosmetic look the way that I wanted to round over the edges. So you can see here, another great Craigslist find for 20 bucks was a little table setup that I could mount a router underneath, and with a round over bit, I'm able to take that body and very carefully and smoothly go around the bottom edge, and then I flipped it over and went around the top edge to just cut in a consistent curve that was going to go around the entire rim, front and or top and bottom of the entire bodies. Now the last thing that I'll show you, in this picture you can see after the process, if you look carefully around the edge, you start to see some dark parts. Well, look, sometimes routing, if you go too slow or if you go over something with maybe a little bit too much force, you can kind of start to burn or scorch the wood because of the high speed and all of that kind of stuff. So I looked at it and I thought, oh no, did I just ruin the aesthetic look to this? But the good news is, with some additional sanding, the darkness in some of those areas is only surface deep. So a little bit more sanding, and I'm able to bring back the color of the wood to what I started with and not have those dark marks. So without further ado, here's what we have at the very end. We're building this match set, and these are the bodies and how they look. Now you'll notice there's some other steps done to these, but this is that pattern that we were attempting to make the entire time. So you can see that gluing up and making these square tiles, gluing them together, getting them set out in the shape of this, and then finally using all of those smoothing and routing techniques, we can get this really nice, smooth, flat curve over the entire surface of the guitar. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this is a perfect process. Over here on the 4-string, one of the things I'll point out is you can see a couple places where there's some darker lines. Well, in gluing these together, this particular last strip actually kind of warped up a little bit. So when I tried to press it back down, it separated, it kind of cracked the glue joint that connected it to the strip next to it. And I tried to fix it by sprinkling some sawdust down in there and then dabbing some super glue to kind of create that cosmetic bond to fill the gap. But by doing so, it just looks darker. So you can kind of tell that there are some darker spots on some of these. But as we've said all project long, this is a DIY adventure. So I am totally fine with some of these bodies looking like somebody made them. So that is how we got the cosmetic look to the tops of these guitars. Well, I hope you got something out of this, and maybe this can be a technique you can try for your own projects. And hey, as always, I want to thank you for watching, and until next time, play on, my friends, play on.